Okay, so let me just to let everyone know, good afternoon and welcome to the 2021 GSHA Virtual Business Meeting and Conference. We hope you enjoy our presentations over the next 2 days. Please be sure that you are muted and your video is off throughout the presentation. Questions will be taken at the end of the presentation using the chat box only. So type your questions into the chat box. Also, any comments you'd like to make. It is my pleasure and honor to present Mr. Alan Steele. Mr. Steele's presentation will be about the inn at the end of the trail. So Mr. Steele, take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I wish I could attend all of your meetings, but not possible at this time. But my pleasure to be with you. The inn at the end of the trail. If you've been to Santa Fe, there's a hotel called the La Fonda, and that became known as the inn at the end of the trail. But surprise, there was a hotel before that one that really was the inn at the end of the trail. And I've just finished a manuscript about that old hotel. It lasted about 100 years there. And it's just full, cram-packed full of stories about people who were involved with the old hotel. And much to my surprise, I discovered as a tour guide here in Santa Fe, I do history tours, that some of the information I was sharing with people on my tours was not correct. And when you start researching any topic, you become clearer on the meaning of things. And on my tours, I'd always said, well, there was always a tour on this, there was always a hotel on this site. But in my research, I discovered that was not really correct. The inn at the end of the trail, actually in the first place, was a group of houses. And that was starting in 1821. In 1821, the Santa Fe Trail opened, bringing merchants from Missouri out to Santa Fe. And there was a gentleman by the name of William Becknell who lived in Missouri, in Franklin, Missouri, the town of Franklin. By the way, that town no longer exists really because it was on the Missouri River, and the Missouri River changed its course and sort of washed out the town. There's a new place called New Franklin that exists. Anyway, William Becknell has been named through history since then as the father of the Santa Fe Trail. And I always had this romantic idea in my mind that William Becknell was an adventurer who just decided he was going to create a trail out through the West, and you know, he would do that to become a hero, a Western hero. But it was not that at all. What I discovered was William Becknell was deeply in debt in Franklin, Missouri. There was a lot of land speculation taking place at that time. This was back in 1820 and a little before. And he invested not very wisely in a number of properties in the area. And he did it on credit. And he ended up owing about $1,000 to about 5 or 6 different people. And $1,000 doesn't sound like much today, but in those days, it was a lot of money. And today, in terms of today's dollars, it would be $20,000 or $30,000. He was in debt. He couldn't repay these people. And so he was desperate. And in his desperation, he had been hearing about Santa Fe and the markets here and the possibility of making good money. And so he decided to take out a trip trekking across to Kansas and into New Mexico, Colorado, New Mexico, to Santa Fe to try to make some money because he had some court appointments coming up. He wanted to avoid those. So before that they started, he got a group together And they started by horseback across the Missouri and into the Great Plains of Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico. And in this desperate attempt to escape his legal problems and to make some money and to boot, he was planning to at least trade for furs that he could bring back to Missouri, or perhaps sell some of his goods to make enough money to pay back his debts. So that was the beginning of the father of the Santa Fe Trail. Now, in my book that I've just finished, it's at the publisher right now, should be out, I'm hoping, by Christmas time, called The Inn at the End of the Trail. Each chapter starts with a quote from a poet or a writer by the name of Matt Field. He was an actor in St. Louis and St. Louis theaters, and he decided he wanted some excitement. So in the 1830s, excuse me, he decided to come out here as well. And he wrote a lot about the desert, the prairies, and the trip out. And so at the beginning of each of the chapters, there's a quote from Matt Field. And I'd like to share with you the quote for the first chapter, because this was done while he was crossing the prairies, coming to the west. And it starts out like this: the prairies, the wild desert plains. After 15 days travel, here we are in a little paradise, a grove of tall trees, through which runs a beautiful stream of water over pebble bottom. Flower and shrub in luxuriant profusion greet the eye, and the cool breeze playing among the rustling leaves adds variation to the songs of birds, while the murmuring stream keeps up a running accompaniment. He had a real art with words. He was an artist in word form. So Becknell, William Becknell came out 1821 with some colleagues. They came horseback. They did not bring wagons at that time. And a month after he arrived in Santa Fe, another pioneer of types, Thomas James, arrived 1 week after Becknell did. But he came mostly by boat on the Arkansas River. And so I sort of call him the father of the Arkansas River Trail to Santa Fe. And when he got here, he rented a house from a very wonderful gentleman, from what all I can tell. His name was Don Francisco Ortiz, and he owned a house on San Francisco Street, which was the main street in Santa Fe. And he rented the house to Thomas James. Thomas James later became a general in his later life. And so he stayed there. And this actually was the beginning of what eventually became the Inn at the End of the Trail, because it was right at the end of the trail in the Santa Fe Plaza. And the first person to start renting rooms and houses to the traders that came from America was Don Francisco Ortiz. So I call him the pioneer of hospitality in the West. Now, the town of Santa Fe only had about 6,000 inhabitants at that time. And Don Francisco was renting rooms to U.S. merchants, and they started coming out as soon as, by the way, while Becknell and Thomas were on their trip out, Mexico actually declared independence from Spain. And before that, the Spanish would not permit any outsiders to come into Spanish territory. But as soon as the trail was opened and Mexico declared independence, the Mexicans welcomed foreigners, especially American traders. In 1823, just 2 years after the other two gentlemen arrived, a man by the name of Bartolome Baca was elected the governor. And he became the first Spanish merchant to organize a trading party to go east. So this was a reversal. The Americans were coming from the east, and he decided to go west. He was the first trader to attempt that. He got a trading group from Santa Fe together, and he came over to Missouri. So the city at that time was not really much to talk about. Matt Field described it like this. He said, "Bricks molded from prairie clay and roasted in the noontide ray, large as the stones of city halls, form good, strong built walls, and trunks and boughs of cottonwood form gates and beams and rafters good." So that was his description of the buildings that he saw when he came here. And then as the 1820s went on, more people of renown started coming to the West. One of those that you will recognize was Kit Carson. He was working in a little leather shop in Missouri, and he decided he wanted something more exciting than that to do in life. And so he joined up with a caravan that was coming out across the Santa Fe Trail. The wagon master was Charles Bent, and Charles Bent's name comes up a little later. It was during this time that a couple of British women who had come over to Texas to be homesteaders, their names were one lady, we don't know her first name, we just call her Mrs. Horn, and the other one was Sarah Harris. They were captured by Comanches down in southern Texas, and they became slaves to the Comanche tribe. And for a year or so, or almost 2 years, they served as servants. And eventually the Comanches came up near Santa Fe and to do trading with the Pueblo Indians. And these two ladies were rescued by a man by the name of William Donahoe. And William Donahoe had come out as a merchant from Missouri, and he actually took over a couple of the houses on the corner where the inn at the end of the trail became located. And his wife ran a little, you might call it an inn or a hotel there. That was really the beginning of the hospitality. After a while, she became known as the lady at the United States House. It became known as the United States House because that's where you could find Americans if you were looking for them, the American merchants. And so that was the first name given to the house on that corner, the United States House. There was a lot of political turmoil in Santa Fe because the Mexican government down in Mexico City appointed a new governor by the name of Colonel Albino Perez. Albino Perez. And a lot of people resented this governor sent from Mexico City by the central government because they had had locals as governors up until that time. And so there was there was quite a bit of uprising, and it was a difficult time for Santa Fe. But eventually Santa Fe rebounded. But during that time of turmoil, when there was quite a bit of uprising against the governor who came from Mexico, actually he originally came from Spain to Mexico and then to be governor in Santa Fe. And during that time, there was a man in New Mexico in the Albuquerque area. His name was Don Manuel Armijo. He was quite someone who would take advantage of any situation. And at the same time, this Texas independence was happening in 1836. And Texas claimed the eastern part of New Mexico, everything from the Rio Grande River east, as part of their territory. They said it was granted by Santa Anna after his defeat at San Jacinto down in Texas. And so Texas claimed all of the Rio Grande as part of their territory. And the Texans sent an expedition to Santa Fe that they thought would be very well welcomed, that everyone in Santa Fe would be happy for the Texans to come and take charge of the place. But instead, Manuel Armijo, the governor, rejected that and didn't want to have anything to do with the Texans. And he was able to capture them. They arrived in a very poor state because it was a long trip from San Antonio all the way up to Santa Fe. And he marched them all down to Mexico City, and they filled the New Mexico City jails for a year or so. So that was the end of the Texas attempt to take over New Mexico. I mentioned the writer Matt Field. I read you a couple of his quotes. He arrived in 1839, and he told us most of the story about Manuel Armijo that we know. And Matt Field, when he arrived, was introduced to Alcalde Don Luis Rubido. And he was the alcalde, or the mayor at that time. He later moved to California. And if anyone is listening who has been to Riverside, there's a little mountain right in downtown Riverside called Rubido Mountain, named after the man who was actually the alcalde of Santa Fe in the 1830s. In the 1840s, there was a feeling that the US should annex the Great Southwest. And the two big territories out here were New Mexico and California. They called it their manifest destiny. President Polk was the leader of this. And so a US Army under General Zachary Taylor was sent to secure the Texas border at the Rio Grande, which Texas claimed. Mexico, of course, objected, and its army attacked the Americans on the other side of the Rio Grande. That attack gave President Polk the opportunity to declare war on Mexico. It became known as the Mexican-American War. And the result was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848. That treaty gave New Mexico and California to the United States. And you need to remember, at that time, there was no Arizona. New Mexico territory went all the way out to the Colorado River, which was the line between California and New Mexico. Arizona did not happen until 1846, nearly 20 years later. So an American army under Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny entered Santa Fe in 1846. By 1847, Santa Fe had a newspaper, and in the newspaper is the first time we hear about the United States Hotel. The United States House had now been named a hotel, and it kept that name for 2 years. Here's another quote from Matt Field that I think is quite lovely. He says, "We sang duets, one on one side and one on the other of a beautiful stream. We sang loud choruses, and the lonely woods gave us back a running accompaniment of echoes. And when the night birds screamed, after we had laid our heads upon our saddles to sleep, we laughed at the poor benighted creatures and raised our voices in merry imitations of the doleful sounds, till the hungry wolves caught up our cry and awed us into silence with their dismal howlings." He just seems to so beautifully describe the travelers as they went across in the direction of Santa Fe. Well, after that, the introduction of the Americans, Santa Fe was a booming place, and a new commander was put in charge of the Santa Fe garrison. His name was General Sterling W. Price. And the hotel got a new name. It became known as the Exchange Hotel. and an overland stage was begun from Missouri out to Santa Fe. You might have heard of Wild Bill Hickok. He was one of the drivers of the first stages that came into Santa Fe. And it was in 1850 that Bishop Jean-Baptiste Lamy arrived, and he became a legendary person here in Santa Fe over the years. Now, shortly after that, in the early 1850s, more people started coming across, headed for California, and the Santa Fe Trail was the most convenient way to come. There were two men in Keosauqua, Iowa. They decided they were going to come out. They were sort of businessmen. One was named Leonard Rose and the other was Alpha Brown. And so they got together a wagon train, came through Santa Fe on the old Santa Fe Trail, continued down to Albuquerque. And down there, they crossed New Mexico over to the area of the Colorado River. At that point, they were attacked by Mojave Indians. Some battles ensued, and they decided they weren't going to go to Colorado, so they returned to Albuquerque. And Mr. Rose came up to Santa Fe, and with money sent to him by his brother-in-law back in Missouri, he bought the old hotel called by that time it was called the Exchange Hotel. He became the owner and manager. Then another invasion of Santa Fe took place during the 1840s, 1846, 47. And then in the 1860s, we had the American Civil War. Confederate Army came up from Texas to take over Santa Fe, Colorado, and on out to California. They were interrupted in their plans by a Union Army that came down from Colorado, and the Battle of Glorieta Pass took place. The hotel at that time became the headquarters for the Confederate Army until they were defeated at the Battle of Glorieta Pass and they retreated to Texas. Henry Hopkins Sibley was the Confederate Army general at that time. After the Civil War, things began to prosper again in Santa Fe. The Exchange Hotel became the center of social life in the city. The only problem was the American Indian tribes were very unhappy with what was happening with the incursion of more and more foreigners. And a new general by the names of James H. Carleton was the commander of the army in New Mexico. And he ordered that the Apaches and the Navajos be relocated from their traditional lands to a place called Bosque Redondo in southern New Mexico. And Kit Carson was given the orders to remove those dear people from their homelands. It was a terrible experience for him. He tried to resign at that time, but the general would not let him do that. And so he was the one who led out in the relocation of the Apaches and the Navajos down to that area. And that's another sad story. And actually part of the trail to Bosque Redondo came through Santa Fe. And I can't imagine a more sad parade going through town than what happened at that time. That's another story as well. After, we get up into the 1860s, there was an incident at the Exchange Hotel that rings in history here in New Mexico. There was a Colonel William Logan Reinerson who came from California to help during the Civil War. And he was down in the southern part of New Mexico. One of the generals from the Civil War for the Union was General John P. Slough. And these two gentlemen became leaders in government here in Santa Fe. They had an argument that took place at the Exchange Hotel. And a day or two later, Reinerson came into the hotel and shot General John P. Slough. So there was a murder in the hotel. And this was also the time in 1872 when Billy the Kid arrived in Santa Fe with his family. And they stayed a few nights, we understand, at the Exchange Hotel. Very exciting times, the Wild West days here in Santa Fe, they've become known as. Also at that time, down in the South, there was an area of the trail that went down from Santa Fe to Mexico City called El Camino Real. And there was a section of that trail called the Jornada del Muerto. And there was a captain in the army, his name was John Martin, who was able to dig a well in the middle of the Jornada del Muerte. And he became famous for providing water during that part of the trail where many people died. And he saved many lives. And he and his wife decided they wanted to get into respectable community. So they came to Santa Fe and they purchased the old hotel. And it was called, they said it was rejuvenated and improved. This was also the time of the Lincoln County War when Billy the Kid was raising havoc down in the middle of the territory. It was also the time that the president sent out a new governor by the name of General Lew Wallace and his wife Susan. They arrived in 1878. And it was he who tried to clear up the Wild West territory at that time. And the story of Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, the sheriff who brought him in, is another story that is part of the story of the hotel as well, because Wallace stayed in the hotel sometime. And anyway, it was quite an exciting time. In 1880, I wrote a book about 1880, and it was published 2 years ago. It's called the Santa Fe 18, let's see, how can we get, it's not focusing, sorry. Santa Fe 1880. And the whole year of 1880 was an incredible year in Santa Fe. And so that book just looks at that 1 year, 1880. That's when the train tracks arrived, the Lincoln County War is going on. The governor every night was writing a book in his office. It was published in 1880. It's called Ben-Hur. It was the most popular novel in the 19th century. So that was a very exciting year, and that's covered in my other book that came out 2 years ago from the History Press. During the 1880s, early 1880s, the Santa Fe Hotel, the Exchange, was still part of the center of town. Ulysses S. Grant, who had just been president, came out and he became president of one of the mining companies out here. And it was 1880 that Sheriff Pat Garrett brought Billy the Kid into jail into Santa Fe. He languished here for 4 months and then was sent south to be tried for murder. He was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. And that's another story as well. The hotel was bought by a couple of entrepreneurs in the city. One of them was Abraham Staub, a Jewish merchant who was one of the leading real estate owners in the city. And then it was sold to a man by the name of John T. Forsha. And he was trying to figure out what to do with the old building. Finally, Mr. Staub sold the hotel to Thomas Winter, another man, in 1907. And his plan was to install small shops all around the hotel, turn it into more like an emporium where people could go and buy things. So the hotel was really showing its age, and the city kept begging the owners to tear it down. Finally, in 1919, there was a war victory rally organized in Santa Fe. And anyone who would come and buy a $100 war bond got the opportunity to ride in an old army tank and push down some of the walls of the old building. The local residents then raised $200,000 to build a new hotel in that place. And an architect by the name of Isaac Rapp was hired to build the new hotel, and it was modeled after a supply building up on the Raton Pass, just over the line in Colorado. It was called the company's supply company, the Colorado Supply Company. So the hotel was modeled after that building. And this style became known as the Santa Fe style. And that's what's seen in the city today. The new hotel was built during 1920 and 21. It opened in 1922. That means next year, the La Fonda Hotel will be celebrating 100 years. And that is what caused me to think of writing this book so that people can appreciate the heritage of the hotel. So in 1926, that hotel was sold to the Santa Fe Railroad, and then it was leased to the Fred Harvey Company, one of the leading tourist companies in the West at that time. And so we come now to the La Fonda Hotel, and that 100 years of the La Fonda Hotel is another story, which involves very much the Fred Harvey Company. So there you have a rundown on the manuscript that is now at the editor. And if I could just close with one more, if we have time, one more comment or a quote from Matt Field. And here's what he said, and it seems to me a good conclusion to this little lecture. When Western enterprise pierces into the yet uncultivated regions, when the log cabin of the distant settler is seen upon the banks of the shallow Arkansas, when cities rise where now the advancing plow has not yet disturbed the sunflower of the tall green blade, then may we hear and listen with interest to the history of early pioneers, and our grandchildren will yet wonder why their fathers and grandfathers spoke not more fluently about that glorious inheritance.
That was lovely. Thank you, Mr. Steele.
You're most welcome.
What was his name again, the poet?
Matt Field, F-I-E-L-D, Matt Field. And his writings were published in a book a few years ago. And it is called Matt Field on the Santa Fe Trail. A really wonderful book, great reading because it flows so well and such incredible descriptions.
Yeah, very much so. All right, well, thank you very much. So what we'll do now is open it up to question and answer. So if anybody has any questions or comments, you can type them in the chat and then I will read them out to Mr. Steele so he can answer them. Okay, can you just type in your question into the chat, David?
With this book, you know, there are so many stories that you can go off on a tangent to read about and to study. Mm-hmm. And so this book really does give that opportunity. There are many stories that could be turned into an own book themselves, you know. Mm-hmm. So it's quite exciting to research it.
Yeah. All right, David Torres says, what happened to Ortiz?
Oh, yes. I wish we knew. He just seems to fade into the sunset. But he seemed to be quite enterprising. There are quite a few records. You look at the land records in the old government files here in Santa Fe. And you see his name popping up all over the place during that time. So he was definitely a leader in the town. He did become the alcalde, and he's the one who helped General James when they decided, the city was deciding to celebrate Mexican independence. And local people had never done that before. And so they relied on him, General James and Ortiz, to lead out in the independence celebrations. So I thought that was quite interesting. And one of them said, well, we need to have a flag. And so they had to come up with a flag. You know, this was a new day. It was Mexico independence. And so they had to learn a lot of things about statehood and what they were doing.
Very good. So can you give me a little bit of your background? You said you did tours in Santa Fe?
Yes, I enjoy doing tours in Santa Fe. I have a little tour company called Discovery Tours. And so every day of the year, every day of the week, we have a history tour that takes place from the La Fonda Hotel at 10 o'clock. And we do that all during the year, spring, summer, winter, fall. Mm-hmm. There are 4 of us who take turns. In addition to that, I do spy tours because there are a number of spy stories here in downtown Santa Fe, not only during the Second World War, but before and after. And then I also do Billy the Kid tours here. You know, Billy always considered Santa Fe as his hometown. Mm-hmm. And he was here during his formative years. He was 11, 12, 13. And then his mother moved the family down south. She had TB, tuberculosis, and she felt like the altitude of Santa Fe was too much for her lungs. And so she moved him down south. Unfortunately, she died a year later and left the 2 little boys as orphans. Mm. And their stepfather didn't care to have them. So there's, you know, a whole story of Billy the Kid. So that's those are the tours I do now. I am considering starting a new tour called the Santa Fe Trail Tour, Santa Fe Trail City Tour. If that happens, it'll be early next year when we start celebrating 100 years at the La Fonda. By the way, this year is the 200th anniversary of the old Santa Fe Trail. So we have anniversaries going right and left here in Santa Fe at the moment. And in next month, I'm going to be with the Santa Fe Trail Association. They're having their annual conference in La Junta, you know, east of where you are.
Yeah.
And so that's going to be taking place there. And that'll be an exciting time too.
For sure.
A lot of incredible history here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I don't see any more questions. So I'd just like to thank you, Mr. Steele, and also thank everyone who attended. It's a fascinating story. And I, for one, have written down a little note to myself about the tours. And I go to Santa Fe once in a while, so I'll definitely be stopping in. Yeah. So
thank you so much. It was fun.
All right. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.